Can you hear me now? As far as I know, we don't have any deaf students here, but what if you were deaf? Would you be a capital D deaf or a little d deaf? You're thinking, what in the world does that mean? Is there a difference? Indeed there is, and it's a cultural difference. Today I'm going to give you some insight into deaf culture and deaf community. Most cultures are based on groups of people who share a location, race, religion, food, art, education, clothing, rituals, etc. Many cultures around the world exist simply because they've been there for hundreds or thousands of years, but this is not necessarily how deaf culture is defined. Before we talk about that, we need to talk about what deafness is. Medically speaking, deafness is defined as hearing loss, where a person is unable to understand speech, even when it's amplified. In profound deafness, even intense sounds may not be detected, and in total deafness, no sounds at all can be heard. Whether you are born deaf, late deafened, get an illness, or head injury, levels of deafness vary. At this point in the explanation, the people who experience this are all deaf with a lowercase d. If you're confused, don't worry, I'm getting there. But this is an important distinction between in-deaf culture, big D, and little d deaf. When someone who is hard of hearing or deaf only describes themselves deaf in medical terms, identifies with mostly hearing people, uses their voice and lip reads, and does not associate with the deaf community, this person is also considered little d deaf. Typically, they will wear hearing aids or cochlear implants. Some culturally deaf individuals will also wear these devices, but they don't need to, and they don't feel like it fixes them, nor do they feel like their deafness needs to be fixed. Some culturally deaf individuals, they're against cochlear implants because it can take away from using sign language exclusively, which is the heart of deaf culture. Deaf authors Carol Patton and Tom Humphreys wrote in their book Deaf in America, quote, "We use the lowercase deaf when referring to the medical condition of not hearing, and the uppercase deaf when referring to a group of deaf people who share a language, culture, and community," end quote. People who are deaf with a capital D identify themselves as culturally deaf and are heavily part of the deaf community. They do not see deaf as a disability, and they don't want to be called hearing impaired. Whether or not they wear hearing aids, they don't usually speak with their voice, even if they can. They take pride in their deafness. To give you an idea of the struggle that some individuals may have getting involved in deaf community or the deaf world, 96% of all deaf babies are born to hearing parents. This means that unless their hearing parents learn ASL and get involved in deaf culture, the child will miss out on a rich cultural world. According to the website handsandvoices.org, deaf children typically gain access to deaf community through education and deaf programs with other deaf children and adults. However, some deaf people never have access to these deaf programs and other deaf people, which leaves them alone in the hearing world. The good news is that people may join this culture, this rich deaf world. The deaf culture community may even include hearing family members of deaf people and sign language interpreters who identify themselves as allies with the deaf culture, even though it doesn't automatically include all people who are deaf or hard of hearing. Language acquisition is the top priority and #1 struggle for a deaf child. Deaf culture values the use of American Sign Language. They value children as the future of the deaf community, and ASL is the heart of the deaf culture. Deaf culture supports bilingual education in ASL and in English. Deaf culture is full of art in many forms. Storytelling and poetry in American Sign Language, just like English, can be funny, sad, emotional, and beautiful. The most captivating thing about ASL is a story, poem, or song is a wonderful, imaginative, visual picture that the artists can paint in the air. Wide open spaces and see-through walls and wide staircases like the ones here at Gallaudet University, the only deaf university in the United States, promote the use of sign language. According to the book Deaf Culture by Irene Lee, deaf people's use of vision to orient themselves to their space and environment is unique. Americans tend to talk over each other a lot. Culturally, deaf people don't tend to do that. Turn-taking and consistent eye contact that shows you're paying attention is expected. Also, head nods are appreciated, and the person who's speaking has the floor until they give you a cue that it's your turn. A short, fun list about what's acceptable in the deaf world would be pointing fingers, waving at someone to get their attention, banging on a table or stomping on the floor, talking about bodily functions, talking about money, giving someone you just met your whole life story or someone else's life story, and being blunt about one's looks. It's not uncommon, nor is it rude, to talk about someone's appearance in deaf culture. Most hearing people would consider it rude to comment on someone's weight, but it's normal for deaf people. They don't just comment on weight, but all sorts of physical features. Also, if you ask for an opinion or feedback, you're going to get a straight and brutally honest answer. Deaf people often show up late, and they're not known for punctuality. When being introduced, it's common to tell many details about a person. Because the deaf world, it's small, and they're always looking for personal connections to people that they may know. Leave-taking takes a long time, and it's considered rude to leave a gathering without saying bye to everyone. Name signs are a unique way to identify someone in the deaf community. They're given to you by another deaf person and usually reflect something special about a person's character, interests, personality, maybe a physical feature. It's a huge honor for a hearing person to receive a name sign in the deaf community. 48 million people in the United States have some sort of hearing loss, and 500,000 people use American Sign Language. Deaf people are so friendly, and they want to communicate with hearing people, even if it's a simple conversation. There are countless resources online to learn ASL, so why not give it a try? Maybe you too can be part of the deaf world.